Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today is day 7 of Aether Drift spoiler season. It's Monday, the start of a brand new week, the second week of spoilers, and I guess we're about halfway through the spoilers. We're also going to cover some cards, just a few that dropped over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, so we do have a lot to get through today. Because of that, we're just going to jam right into it as quick as possible. Be sure to like this video, it helps me get it out to more people, it helps the channel to grow. Subscribe if you're new, and catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/quarantinecapricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. Now let's talk about these cards. We're going to start off with Voyage Home, a sorcery for a whopping 7 mana in the colors of Azorius, but there's a catch because it has affinity for artifacts. Now, we've already seen one card coming to this set, a black card that has affinity for artifacts, so seeing a second card here that has it, and it being an uncommon to boot, makes me think that it might be back as an actual mechanic, and there might be a handful of cards in this set actually sporting the affinity for artifacts ability, and that's kind of worrying and kind of exciting at the same time. If you have as many as 5 artifacts or more in play when you play this, it only costs you 2 mana, and you get to draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. That is absolutely insane. But even if you don't get to that total of 5 or more, you know, say you have like 3 artifacts out, you're still going to be able to play this for 4 mana, draw 3 cards, gain 3 life. And I think that gain 3 life is kind of important, because honestly, drawing 3 cards for 2 mana at the top end as the ceiling is bananas all by itself. But you're not going to always optimally be able to cast this spell that way, and having this incidental 3 life helps you kind of fight back against the aggro decks, last longer against them, make it so that it takes them an extra turn to win the race, and sometimes you're going to need that. So it almost kind of acts like a fail-safe plan B for the card, where if you're trying to play it on curve and things aren't going optimally for you, you can get that little bit of extra life to kind of make up for it. But man, drawing 3 cards for potentially 2 mana is insane. I can't wait to see how deep affinity for artifacts goes. But next up, we've got Dredger's Insight. This is 1 green and 1 for an enchantment. Whenever 1 or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard, you gain a life. When this enchantment enters, you mill 4 cards. You may put an artifact, creature, or land card from among the milled cards into your hand. So this is kind of like an Overlord of the Baelmerk, except without the creature side to it, which obviously isn't as exciting as Baelmerk. But what is exciting about this card is the fact that it can find you a creature, an artifact, or a land. Baelmerk can't find you a land. And this still counts as an enchantment, a permanent, when it's in your graveyard. So it's going to help for things like Descend, it's going to help with things like Delirium, and then getting to gain incidental life every time an artifact or creature leaves your graveyard is really nice too. It might see play in Insidious Roots decks. It's not only gassing that deck up the way that it wants and finding you the thing you need that you milled away, but it's also gaining you life every time you're exiling to make plant tokens with Insidious Roots, and that seems kind of awesome. I guess the one big downside to this is that if you mill your Insidious Roots with your Dredger's Insight, you don't get to grab it, because this can only find an artifact, creature, or land, and you do have to be a little bit careful about that when considering where you should play this card. Next up, we've got Haunted Hellride. This is a 3/3 artifact vehicle for 3 mana in the colors of Dimir. It accrues for just 1, and whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn, and then you untap it. This card is deceptively good. Like, don't pay any attention to the fact that it's a 3/3 vehicle that can accrue for 1, because this ability triggers on attack no matter what. You don't have to attack with the Haunted Hellride, and you don't have to target the Haunted Hellride with the ability, and you don't even need to target the thing that attacks with the ability. As long as you drop this on 3 and you can swing in with any creature at all, you get to target whatever you want to get +1/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn and untap. So your, you know, on curve 2-drop is now swinging in with extra power and Death Touch if you want, and you untap it, so it's almost like it got Vigilance. But it gets even better than that, because you could untap a creature that isn't even attacking as long as you're attacking with something. So you could target a creature that you tapped for mana during your first main phase, and then use it for mana again during your second main phase. or untap any creature that has a tap ability that gives you value, and then as long as you can swing in, you can just target that thing and untap it and get extra value that way. So when you start to consider the card in those sorts of ways, and then also add to that the fact that this can be a 3/3 vehicle as well that crews for just 1, so you have even more value on the board. And I really start to think that this is going to be a sleeper and a really crazy card. Definitely insane in limited. Very, very high pick in limited. But I think this is going to make a pretty crazy splash in constructed as well, in standard specifically. I would be very surprised if there aren't some kind of Dimir deck that's aggro that's using this, or even some kind of new vehicle deck that uses this card. There's so much potential for a card like this. But next up, we've got Ranger's Refueler. Talk about potential. This is another 3/3 artifact vehicle for 1 blue and 1. It crews 2 this time and has an exhaust ability. For 4 mana, it becomes an artifact creature and you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So at some point later in the game, if you're sick of crewing it, you just spend 4 mana and it's a 4/4 artifact creature for the rest of the game, never needs to be crewed again. But the real value in this card lies in the first line of text. Whenever you activate an exhaust ability, draw a card. Full stop. That ability is absolutely insane, and I really truly think that this card might be like the next up the beanstalk. I don't know if it's quite as good, but in some ways I think it might be better. If you're going super deep into exhaust abilities, just turning every single exhaust ability into a cantrip is nuts. And the fact that some creatures have multiple exhaust abilities on them means you have access to activating multiple abilities that can each draw you an extra card, which is also kind of insane. But what really makes this bananas, completely over the top bananas, is the fact that exhaust is pretty broken with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and we've already talked about a few different cards that are just going to be insane with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, because you can give all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters whatever exhaust abilities you want of whatever you're exiling with the Soul Cauldron, and that gets around the fact that each exhaust ability can only be used once for the entire game. And a lot of those exhaust abilities are very powerful and very inexpensive because of the fact that they can only be used once. So now all of a sudden your entire board consists of creatures that can each use an exhaust ability once, and you can go absolutely ham just triggering a ton of exhaust abilities. And if you have something like Ranger's Refueler out and you're also cantripping and drawing a card every time you do it, that's just bananas. So we're absolutely going to build that deck, and I'm going to even go out on a limb and say that's going to be like the deck that makes the biggest splash during early access on stream. And by the time those 24 hours are up, I think everybody's going to be talking about Agatha's Soul Cauldron and how crazy a deck like that can be. This card's going to be a key part of that. But even beyond the Soul Cauldron, I'm excited to brew with this and try it in other decks that just have enough incidental exhaust stuff. Kind of in the way that there are enough incidental high cost things that don't need to be played for high cost with something like Up the Beanstalk. So be interesting to just see how deep we can go with brewing it in a similar fashion to Up the Beanstalk, and I'm super excited to do that. But next up, we've got Roadside Assistance. 1 white and 2 for an enchantment aura. It enchants a creature or a vehicle, gives that permanent +1/+1 and lifelink, but also when this aura enters, you create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token that saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. This is a nice way of getting around automatic card disadvantage for an aura, where you play this on your creature or vehicle, and then if they kill that creature or vehicle, you lose 2 cards instead of 1. And they only used 1 removal spell, right? And there are a lot of different ways over the last few years that R&D has been exploring, trying to make auras worth using and getting around that automatic 2-for-1 value if your opponent uses removal. And this is another way to do that, giving you a 1/1 in addition, so that if they kill the thing that disenchants, you're still left with some board presence, is super nice. The fact that that 1/1 is able to crew and saddle and all of that, very, very relevant creatures, vehicles and mounts and that sort of thing, is super good, I think. This is absolutely going to be awesome in limited. Pretty decently high pick because of the 2-for-1 value, if you're in the right deck that's using enough mounts or vehicles. But I wonder if this might make a splash in standard. I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not. But because it does have that 2-for-1 value, it is possible. But we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Reckless Velocitor, a 3/3 Minotaur pilot for 1 red and 3. Whenever this creature saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, that mount or vehicle gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. So definitely going to be kind of better for mounts, because mounts pretty much have to be saddled during your main phase, so you're always getting the value, whereas with vehicles, you can kind of crew them at instant speed whenever you want. And so there are going to be situations where you have to choose between getting the value off of this and, you know, having your vehicle be a surprise and that sort of thing on blocks and stuff like that. So not as good with vehicles, but I mean, I guess it depends on how you're playing the deck, right? If you're just going ham and swinging in and being super aggressive with your vehicles, it's probably not going to be any worse there than it would be for mounts, right? But still, a 4-mana 3/3 that's an uncommon that you can pick up pretty easily in a draft that gives this ability that turns like your best mount or vehicle into a legitimate win condition once a turn, and if they deal with it, you could just do it to another one. Pretty decent and limited. I like it. Next up, we've got River Churn Monument, another rare. This is 1 blue and 1 for an artifact. You can pay 1 mana, tap it. Any number of target players each mill 2 cards. So you could use this on yourself to self-mill if you want things in the graveyard. You can use this on the opponent to mill them if you're playing an actual mill deck that tries to win by milling your opponent, which I'm cringing at the thought of that being a normal thing within the standard meta again, so I don't know how I feel about this card anymore. But it also has an exhaust ability, 2 blue and 2, tap it, any number of target players, each mill cards equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. The fact that you can choose any number of target players, you can self-mill yourself when it's beneficial to you, use it to try and mill the opponent to get closer to milling them out and winning the game when it's beneficial to do it that way, and sometimes just use it on both of you if the situation calls for that and you want both of those things at the same time. I think the versatility with this card is interesting. The fact that it can be used in a self-mill deck or a mill deck or a deck that tries to combine both of those things. That being said, it doesn't have any board presence whatsoever. So when you play this, you're kind of taking a turn off, which feels a little bit bad. So I'm not sure how good this actually ends up being in the long run. But the fact that it's a rare leads me to believe that there are going to be a handful of other cards supporting bringing actual mill decks back into standard, and if that's the case, maybe this is a key part of that, and maybe that deck will be strong enough that you absolutely slam 4 copies of this. We're gonna have to wait and see when the entire set is spoiled, but I'm kind of terrified of mill coming back to standard. I used to have nightmares about the rogue deck, if you guys remember that Dimir mill rogue deck back in the day when it was in standard, and I do not want that again. So please no. But next up, we've got Aether Jacket. This is a 2/1 artifact creature Thopter for 3 colorless mana. It has flying and vigilance, and you can pay 2, tap, and sack this creature to destroy another target artifact, activate only as a sorcery. I love that we have a common way here of having incidental artifact removal in our deck. That's not a dead card if we don't need to remove an artifact. That makes this absolutely slammable in our main deck, in limited, and it's going to be nuts. Honestly, there's so many crazy powerful artifacts in this set that having a decently reasonably costed piece of artifact removal that isn't useless if your opponent doesn't have good artifacts, that is still a 2-power flying vigilance creature, is actually really good. There's also a number of artifact synergies in this set that get value off having more artifacts in place, so this adds to that as well. The more I think about it, the more I think this card is actually really pushed as a common, and I think it might end up being one of the better commons you can grab and draft. But next up, we've got Slick Imitator. This is a 1/3 ooze for 1 blue and 1. It has Start Your Engine, so if you're not already, it puts you at speed 1, and on each of your turns where your opponent loses life, you get to increase your speed by 1 until you hit 4, which becomes max speed, and you unlock any max speed abilities. With this card in particular, it has max speed, pay 1, sacrifice this creature, copy target spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So if there is a deck where you're able to just rank up your speed super easily, super efficiently, without having to go out of your way too much, getting access to a body that can maybe defend a little bit in the early game and then all of a sudden just pop for only 1 mana and copy your best spell seems kinda nuts. And it's worth pointing out, it copies any spell. It doesn't have to be like an instant or sorcery. It can copy a very balmy creature or a very balmy enchantment or something like that, and just absolutely give you insane value. It's also worth noting, if you're in the Start Your Engines deck, this kind of serves dual functions, where early in the game it can make sure you're starting your engines early if you haven't already, and then later on can finally eventually be sacked for that max speed. And if you have other ways to get value off of speed in the deck, you can get more out of this card. And I think that's kind of interesting. I think Start Your Engines is going to be a lot more relevant than people realize right now, especially because you don't have to attack and deal combat damage in order to tick up your speed. There's so many other incidental ways you can do it, whether it's Hopeless Nightmare and Nurturing Pixie decks, or just playing it in a burn deck because your burn's automatically upping your speed without their blockers being able to muddy it up and slow you down. And I think in a deck like that, this could be kind of bananas. So I'm excited to brew with this. I'm excited to see if it ends up being good enough. But next up, we've got Transit Mage. This is a 2/2 human wizard for 1 blue and 2. And when it enters, you may search your library for an artifact card with mana value 4 or 5, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. A dude that is okay stat-wise, that also tutors for potentially your best bomb in your deck in Limited, actually seems kind of nuts. Now, you do have to build around it a little bit. You have to have a really good artifact that costs 4 or 5, but there's so many crazy good artifacts in this set that shouldn't be too hard to do. So getting access to a draftable, uncommon tutor that's got a body attached and finds you like your win condition that just wins the game for you actually seems kind of nuts. It even has a chance of seeing play in Constructed in Standard specifically, and if you have ideas about specifically what artifacts that cost 4 or 5 you think would be absolutely nuts and the best targets for this thing to grab, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like there's potential for this to maybe see play in Standard just because of that sheer value. But I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. If you have ideas, let me know for sure. But next up, we've got Risen Necro Regent. This is a 5/4 zombie cat knight for 1 black and 4. It has Start Your Engines, and at max speed, at the beginning of your end step, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This thing is insanely pushed in Limited. I think it's probably too slow for Standard. I don't expect it to see play there. But in Limited, especially if you're able to start your engines early enough, this just comes down and gets you insane value. A 2/2 every single turn in Limited is just eventually going to win you the game, right? And the fact that you get a relevant 5 power body for your 5 mana on top of that ability is nuts. Sure, you do have to get to max speed and all of that jazz, but even if you don't get to max speed, even worst case scenario, if you have to play this earlier than you want, you haven't been able to tick up your speed like you've wanted to, it's still a 5/4 body for 5, which is fine, and it's still only 1 black mana, so it's splashable, and it's still a zombie and a cat and a knight, and gets all of those tribal benefits and payoffs. So I actually think this card's going to be really, really good in Limited, and it's going to be even better in the decks that can take advantage of ticking up your speed as early as possible and as efficiently as possible. Very good card. But next up, we've got Ghastly Raider. This is a 2/1 vampire rogue for 1 black and 2. It also has Start Your Engines. When this creature enters, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an instant or sorcery from it, and that player discards that card. And at max speed, this creature gets +1/+1 in Menace. I think this card is amazing in Limited. I don't know if it might be too slow for Constructed. That being said, being able to get rid of their piece of spot removal in Standard while also getting board presence and potentially even being able to flicker this to get more value later on is kind of nice. It's sort of a burglar rat, but I feel like more often than not it's better than a burglar rat because you get to choose, even though you can only hit an instant or sorcery, and if they don't have one of those in their hand, you're going to whiff with it. But what's great is even when you whiff, you have a relevant creature, and if you're playing your deck appropriately and actually getting to max speed consistently, efficiently enough, having a 3/2 menace for 3 is kind of good enough on its own a lot of time. So when you put both of them together, it's pretty insane. In Limited, this is going to be a slam dunk. Grab this card, play it, get their removal out of their hand, and get a relevant creature, even if it's not relevant right away. You have time in Limited to get there. So I think this card is just going to be bananas in that format. But in Standard, I do think it has a chance of seeing play if you're very, very careful with how you build your deck and what kind of deck you use this in. But next up, we've got Racer's Scoreboard, an artifact for 4 colorless mana. It has Start Your Engines. When it enters, you get to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. And at max speed, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This is a very interesting card, and I don't know how I feel about it. On the one hand, if you're able to gas up quick enough and get to max speed quick enough, you could just play this, and immediately everything costs 1 less, right? You could play this on turn 5, and then play a 2-drop for your 1 extra mana that's left over with the 1 cost reduction. It counts for every single spell, so it's not just instants and sorceries. All your artifacts, all your creatures, all your enchantments, everything costs 1 less. And even if it is a little bit slow, you're also getting card advantage and card selection, because you're effectively drawing a card when you play it, but also kind of drawing an extra card even though you're discarding a card, so you're digging 2 cards deeper. There's a lot about this card that's to love. I think in Limited, it's going to be really good as card draw, but the cost reduction thing isn't going to matter as much. In Constructed, the cost reduction matters a lot more and is probably the #1 reason you'd want to try to brew around this card, but the card draw ends up being more incidental and not as big a deal. I don't think there's any format that absolutely loves both parts of these cards equally. And it makes me a little bit hesitant about how much it will see play. I think there are certain decks in Limited that will want to use this for sure. It's especially good that it's, colorless and it can easily be slotted into any deck. It's also nice that it's another way to start your engines if you've fallen behind and you haven't been able to start your engines yet. But yeah, I wonder what deck really wants this. I feel like there's something out there that wants to play this card, and there are intentions specifically that Wizards has for where this card will be used, but I'm not really sure where that is off the top of my head. If you have ideas about what kind of deck would best use this, or maybe what archetype in Limited is going to be able to use this the most, definitely let me know in the comments. But it's definitely an interesting card no matter what, and I'm excited to see if it can do something. But next up, we've got Gas Guzzler. 1 black mana for a 2/1 vampire rogue with Start Your Engines. It enters tapped, as a lot of the good black 1-drops tend to do, but it has a max speed ability where you can pay 1 black mana, sacrifice another creature or vehicle, and draw a card. So, if you're at max speed, this gets you a sacrifice outlet that you can use repeatedly for 1 mana each time, that is not only a sacrifice outlet, but also draws you cards. There has to be a deck that uses that, right? We've already seen a ton of crazy support for like this new zombie aristocrat sacrifice style deck. Maybe it's not fully a zombie deck, right? Maybe we don't have to go super deep into zombies for it. Maybe we can use the zombie payoffs, but also use stuff like this for even more payoffs. And if we can get to max speed quick, getting an ability like this turned on is going to be nuts if we have a ton of sacrifice payoffs that are also on the board. But one thing I think is easily overlooked about this card is it's just a really easy way to make sure we're starting our engines on turn 1. I think the key to some of the start your engines decks, especially in Constructed, especially in Standard, but even in Limited to a certain extent, is making sure that we turn them on right away on turn 1. So the power level and consistency and how relevant Start Your Engines ends up being in Standard depends completely on how many really good 1-drop Start Your Engines cards there are, because the further we get away from starting our engines on turn 1 consistently, the worse that as a mechanic ends up being overall. And so 1-drops that are good and also start your engines, that we're not just wasting. We don't want to play a crappy 1-drop, right, just because it starts our engines. So it has to be good enough to see play even if it didn't have start your engines, but also have start your engines. That's important. And I think this card is that. And then also, just, you know, if there are any lands that start your engines, that would be insane. I don't think they're going to do that. I think that would probably be too good. So we are really going to have to lean on 1-drops that start your engines that are also good enough regardless of starting your engines. And I think this is an absolute example of that. So the more cards we get like that, the more of a chance start your engines has in standard in particular. And I think this card's going to be an important part of that. I also love that it's a vampire. That means Vampire Tribal can come back. We were waiting for other really good 1-drop vampires. We got one red 1-drop vampire in Foundations. That's pretty good. But that's the only like really good vampire 1-drop that we have in standard right now. And in order for Vampire Tribal to really come back in a significant way in standard, we need enough really good 1-drops so that we can convoke out the Baron like super quick, right? And this absolutely does that. So I am really, really excited to brew with this card in a multiple different types of decks, mostly Aristocrats, but even Vampire Tribal, and maybe even just to start your engines deck in general. Lots of potential for this card. I could go on and on and on. In fact, I kind of have for a little bit now, but let's move on. Next up, we've got Veteran Beast Rider, a 3/4 human knight for 3 mana in the colors of Selesnya. At the beginning of your end step, you untap each creature you control, and then for 4 mana, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. And if you want, if you actually have the mana for it, you can activate that multiple times. I think this guy is nuts in Limited. 3 mana 3/4 with any kind of upside is already absolutely playable in Limited for sure. But that upside, essentially giving everything super vigilance, is bananas, right? It's better than vigilance. It's like all of your attackers get vigilance, except your things you don't want to attack with that have tap abilities also get to be used a second time. So it's better than vigilance for sure. Giving super vigilance to your entire board would be good enough and make this a high pick in Limited, just that. But then the fact that it also has this activated ability that buffs your whole team is just gravy. And it's kind of nuts that it's pushed that hard. I think this is going to be a very high pick in Limited for sure. And don't forget, there are a number of cards floating around that make a significant amount of mana that's limited to only being able to be used on activated abilities and stuff and not actually casting spells. So this synergizes with some of those cards as well and gets even better. And it's 2 very relevant creature types, you know, human in addition to knight, the human being more relevant, of course. And that might make this matter enough in standard, possibly. It is possible this could see play in standard. I doubt it. I don't know if it's fast enough, but if there are enough crazy tap abilities where you can absolutely gas up by playing something like this, then it is possible this sees play in standard. Maybe even with all those Agatha's Soul Cauldron decks we're thinking about making, because then all of your creatures can use their abilities twice a turn instead of once. That seems good. Is it good enough? I don't know. Let me know in the comments, but we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Thundering Broodwagon, a 6/5 artifact vehicle with menace and reach for 6 mana in the colors of Golgari. It crews for 3, it has cycling 2, and when it enters, you destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. Man, this card does so much. Insane in Limited, because if you get it early and you're nowhere near to getting to that 6 mana to play it, you just cycle it away. You dig into those land drops that you need to drop, or get 1 card closer to your bomb, or whatever the case may be, or even a piece of removal that you do have enough mana to cast. But if you top deck this a little bit later in the game when you're at 4, 5, or 6 mana, and you can, you know, hold on to it until you have 6 mana to play it, you could just destroy their best permanent that costs 4 or less and get a 6/5 menace reach vehicle. And I think the best way to use this is probably, I'm assuming now that I see this card, that there's an archetype in Limited in this set where it's sort of like a reanimator style deck, but you're cycling things away that you want to reanimate. We've already seen a couple cards that can bring vehicles back from the graveyard, so cycling this away early and then using one of those cards to put it straight into play from the graveyard, not only did you cycle and draw a card, but you got out this huge vehicle with Menace and Reach that also kills their best permanent that costs 4 or less. And if you're playing that on like turn 4 or 5, you're probably killing their best permanent regardless, because they've only had like 4 mana to play something at that point. Could be really, really nuts. So being an uncommon, being able to pick this up in draft relatively easily, I kind of love it. I don't think it's quite statted enough for use in standard play, although it is possible. It is absolutely possible if there's a deck that can just keep bringing back things from the graveyard efficiently. This could see play just as an incidental way of just cycling things away, drawing cards, and getting, you know, value every time you're able to bring something back. But I think it's probably a little too much, a little costed too much for what it does for play in that format. But in Limited, I do think this card's going to be absolutely bonkers. Next up, we've got Voyage Home. We already talked about this card. We talked about this card at the beginning, didn't we? Yes, we absolutely talked about this card at the beginning. It's busted, but it's not busted enough for us to talk about it twice. Let's move on. Next up, we've got Dune Drifter. This is a 3/3 artifact vehicle for 1 black, 1 white, and X. So it could be played for just 2 mana. It is a 3/3 vehicle with crew 2, and when it enters, you return target artifact or creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. What I like about this the most is the fact that you don't have to put any mana into X if you don't want to. You could just pay 2 mana and potentially get a 0-cost artifact back for free, which is kind of just value, and makes me wonder if a card like this might actually see play in older formats that have a lot of powerful 0-cost artifacts. But there might even be some interesting 0-cost artifacts in this format in Standard that it still might see play in that way. I can't think of any off the top of my head. So if there are any cool 0-cost artifacts, or I guess even 0-cost non-artifacts, you could have creatures that cost X mana, or whatever that, you could have spells that cost X mana, I suppose. I don't think there are any in Standard right now, but if there's anything that costs X or costs 0 that you could hit with this, even if you paid 0 into X, let me know in the comments. I think it could be fun, and in that way, it triggers on entering the battlefield, so you could flicker Dune Drifter, you know, and re-trigger it for 0 and get something back. So maybe the turn that you play it for X amount of mana to get something very specific that actually costs an amount of mana straight onto the battlefield, but then in subsequent turns, maybe you have ways to flicker this, and you can also get back some of your 0-cost stuff, which would be kind of cool. Yeah, I think there's interesting ways to use this. I don't know how relevant that actually ends up being in Standard, but even if you just use this fairly to get back whatever, and then maybe like bounce this back to your hand with Pixies so that you can do it again sometime in the future, this could be a cheap play with Pixie, actually. I didn't think about that before. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of potential with this card, and we're just scratching the surface. I can't think of exactly what I'd want to do with it off the top of my head, but there's definitely some cool stuff you could do with a card like this, especially because it's scalable, right? You can dump a bunch of mana into it to make a huge, crazy play, or you can just find ways to efficiently get back cheap stuff. I think that's pretty cool. But next up, we've got Pride of the Road. 1 white and 3 for a 2/5 zombie cat warrior with vigilance. Man, there are a lot of creatures in this set that have 3 creature types, and that's kind of bananas, but all 3 of these types are relevant. It also has Start Your Engines, and at max speed, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature or vehicle you control gains double strike until end of turn. This card's going to be really, really good in the Start Your Engines decks, if you can consistently get there. If you can't, it's kind of just mid. I think in normal decks that like have some Start Your Engines in there, but aren't like super deep into it, this is just very mid. But if you're in a deck, in Limited specifically, that is 100% built around starting your engines on turn 1 and getting to max speed as quickly as possible, then the consistency of a card like this goes way up, and it gets pretty insane. If you can drop this on 4 and immediately have max speed and give 1 creature every single turn double strike, while also having another 2/5 body with vigilance, that feels kind of nuts. So, I mean, you do have to be consistent enough for it to be more than mid, so I don't know if this will actually get there, but it does have the potential to be absolutely insane and a high pick. It just really needs enough enabling and enough consistency with that start your engines mechanic that it's turning on almost all the time when you drop it on 4. And if you can do that, this card's going to be bananas. But next up, we've got Diversion Unit, a 2/1 robot, artifact creature robot, for 1 blue and 1. It has flying, and you can pay 1 blue and sacrifice this creature, counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3. I kind of love this card. Like, it's an on-rate evasive creature that also counts as an artifact. That seems really good by itself in limited. Like, not really good, but when you take into account the fact that for just 1 mana, you can sack it and counter any instant or sorcery unless they pay 3, you're like always holding up this threat of activation, and your opponent always has to play around. Is he going to pop it this time? Is he going to pop it? And that alone means your opponent's going to like hold back some of their better instant or sorcery spells trying to play around this. It's going to slow down your opponent, force them to make lesser plays as they try to get around your diversion unit. And the entire time you're swinging for 2 damage in the air every turn. And it contributes to all of your, artifact synergies that care about how many artifacts you have down. So there's a lot to like about this card. I think it's actually going to end up being really, really good. And I kind of love it. I don't know if it's quite good enough for standard. There might be some deck out there. If the artifact deck, the go wide artifact deck, really cares about having access to, a counterspell ability like this could see play in standard too. But I think in limited it's going to be nuts. Next up, we've got the Speed Demon, a 5/5 legendary creature demon with flying and trample for 2 black and 3. It has start your engines, so it's a pretty relevant win condition, but at the beginning of your end step, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is your speed. So you don't have to get to max speed to get value off this card, which is awesome. No matter what, when you slam this, even if you're in a deck where you have nothing else with start your engines, you slam this, start your engines, put yourself at speed 1. You have a 5/5 flying trample for 5 that draws you a card and makes you lose a life at the end of every single one of your turns. Like, that's the floor of this card. But if you're able to tick up that speed, you start to be able to draw 2 cards, 3 cards, 4 cards every turn, and that's insane. And on top of that, if you're in a deck that's already utilizing start your engines and you can get to max speed before you ever play this, you slam it. Not only do you have a 5/5 flying trample win condition that your opponent absolutely has to deal with, but you get to draw 4 cards at the end of your turn before your opponent gets access to any sorcery speed removal or access to untapping their lands, even if they do have instant speed removal but they're tapped out. You're going to get that card advantage off it no matter what. And at that point, your opponent's going to untap and have to decide, like, do I even want to kill this thing? They already got the value, and they're probably going to overvalue me no matter what. Or do I leave it there so that they take an extra 4 damage every single turn and hope that I can ride that to victory and kill them quicker before they can use all the card advantage that they're getting? Definitely puts your opponent in a very, very difficult situation where they have to make a very hard choice. And I think that makes the card crazy. It's also worth noting that because it's a demon, it works really well with Unholy Annex. Right, it'll turn that on, so you get to draw an extra card off of that and drain for 2, make back some of the life that you lost, and draining for 2 is going to make your opponent lose life on your turn and tick up your speed by 1 as well. So you can eventually start to grow your speed over time if you have this and an Unholy Annex out, which is pretty awesome. But the absolute mother of all combinations is definitely using this with Sheoldred. And thank God Sheoldred's going to rotate out of standard in like 6 or 7 months, because I am so sick of that card. But I am kind of glad we do have like a 6-month period where we can use this with Sheoldred, because that's going to be a super fun combination. It's just going to get really old really quick, and I can't wait when it rotates. But if you have Sheoldred out when you play this, you're going to, if you're at max speed, you draw 4 cards, lose 4 life, gain 8 life. So you're basically drawing 4 cards and gaining 4 life. Not only that, but potentially Sheoldred could help you kind of tick up your speed as well. Not necessarily with its ability, but just because it's a decently statted attacker with Death Touch that your opponent a lot of times doesn't want to have to chump block if they don't have to. If you can get in for damage in combat, you can tick up take up your speed. So pretty interesting. Yeah, I just, man, I think there's so many ways this could end up being nuts in Standard, and I'm really excited to brew with it. I'm really happy it's a demon, for sure. But next up, we've got Ghastly Blockbuster. This is 1 red and 2 for a 3/2 human berserker, and when it enters, you may sacrifice a creature or a vehicle, and when you do, destroy target artifact and opponent controls. I love this as a common because it is another way of adding incidental artifact removal into your main deck without it being a wasted card if you don't need the artifact removal, right? It can just come down and be a 3/2 for 3, which isn't the greatest thing in the world, but it will at least be an on-curve play so that you can keep up with your opponent's tempo. But then when you need it to be, if they have a crazy, a crazy artifact in play that you absolutely need to get rid of, you can just sacrifice your worst creature or vehicle. Could even just be this card, or it could be something worse, like a 1/1 or whatever, and get rid of their thing and still have the body. I think what makes this card playable is definitely the fact that it's that incidental artifact removal. You can main deck this and not have it be a wasted card in decks it's not great against. So yeah, I don't think this is going to be like a high pick or anything like that, but you'll definitely play it. Next up, we've got Loxodon Surveyor, a 3/3 Elephant Scout for 1 green and 2. It has Start Your Engines, and at max speed, you can pay 3 mana and exile this card from your graveyard to draw a card. I love this mechanic. This is going to be probably one of the better commons in the set, to be honest. A relevant 3/3 body for 3 that wants to trade with your opponent's creatures, because when it's in your graveyard, eventually you can just exile it from your graveyard to draw a card, just get free value off of it. That's really, really good. So it also incidentally starts your engines, which is kind of cool about it. If you're in that deck and you haven't been able to start your engines yet, you get a little bit of extra value off this card by making sure you start your engines on turn 3 and not later than turn 3, while still, playing your thing that keeps up with your opponent's board presence and that sort of thing. So I really like this card a lot. I actually think it's going to be one of the higher pick commons in the set in Limited. But next up, we've got Scrap Compactor. This is an artifact that just costs 1 colorless mana. You can pay 3, tap it, and sacrifice it to deal 3 damage to target creature, or you can pay 6, tap it, and sacrifice it to destroy a creature or vehicle. I kind of love this. Now, don't get me wrong, both modes are overcosted for what they do, and if either mode was by itself, this card would be pretty bad. But I like the versatility of getting both, right? You can jam this for just 1 mana, and you can sit back and try to wait to take out their bomb with it for 6. But if you end up being desperate and have to deal with a creature that has 3 or less toughness before you get to 6 mana, you have this backup mode where you can just sack it, kill the thing, and it can dig you out of a problem that way. So I think the versatility of this card is going to make it a little bit more usable than it otherwise would be. That being said, it's still not like a high pick or anything. If you're low on removal in your deck, you'll play this. You'll be able to pick it up pretty easily late in a draft. But keep it in mind, because I don't think it's quite as bad as it looks on the surface, just because of the versatility. But next up, we've got Spike Shell Harrier. I kind of love this card because it is an obvious nod to Mario Kart, which is hilarious. Are we going to get a Mario or like Nintendo themed set in the future? Is this a nod at a Future Universes Beyond set? I kind of feel like it is. I don't know, maybe it's just me. This is a 4/4 artifact creature robot turtle for 1 blue and 4. And when this creature enters, you return target creature or vehicle an opponent controls to its owner's hand. And if that opponent's speed is greater than each other player's speed, you reduce that opponent's speed by 1. This effect can't reduce their speed below 1. So it literally functions just like the first place shells in Mario Kart, where it seeks out whatever player is going the fastest, whichever player's in first place, and like knocks them down for a little bit so that they fall behind and get slower. This does that. It bounces whatever creature you want or vehicle back to their opponent's hand, slowing down that creature as far as tempo is concerned, right? You have to take the time to recast it and all of that, but also slows down your opponent's speed by 1, like literally reducing speed like a first place shell would. I just kind of love that about this. It's also just not a bad card. Like a 4/4 for 5 that has built-in pseudo removal and gives us the only way we've seen so far to reduce an opponent's speed, I feel like that's a lot. I feel like this might get kind of overlooked early on, but will actually end up being a very relevant card in Limited in this set. It's even possible this could see play in Standard. It does enough, especially if, you know, start your engines decks, max speed decks end up being really powerful and or popular. This could see play as like a sideboard option maybe that gives you value while also slowing them down, which is really, really nice. So I love that they went there with this card, and I really do wonder if it's a nod at Nintendo coming to a Universes Beyond set later on. If you think I'm right about that, let me know in the comments for sure. But next up, we've got Daring Mechanic, a 3/3 human artificer for 1 white and 2, and you can pay 1 white and 3 to put a +1/+1 counter on target mount or vehicle. This isn't anything special, but at least the body is somewhat on rate, and it gives you this mana sink you can use later in the game when you're out of gas to just add value that sticks forever in the form of +1/+1 counters to like the creatures that are going to get the most out of that. So it's not nothing. It's going to especially be better in the decks that have ways of generating extra mana that can only be used for activated abilities. We've seen a few of those cards, but it's still not going to be like first pickable. It's a card you pick up a little bit later in the draft if you're in that archetype and you don't have anything better to grab, and maybe it helps you fill out your curve and that sort of thing. But next up, we've got Embalmed Ascendant. I am in love with this guy. This is a 1/2 zombie for 3 mana in the colors of Orzhov. It has Start Your Engines, and also when this creature enters, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. That's already pretty good. Getting a 1/2 zombie and a 2/2 zombie for 3 mana is super, super good in zombie decks where you're going to have tons of lords that are able to buff up your zombies. If you have even just one lord out, or drop a lord the next turn, this is basically making you a 3/3 and a 2/3 for 3 mana. And it just gets even crazier from there if you happen to have another lord ability or other ways to incidentally make your zombies more valuable. You can even play it from the graveyard with some of the other zombie synergies that we've seen, like Zool Asher and stuff like that. I just love this card, even before we get to the max speed ability. But then you get to the max speed ability, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. So it basically becomes a pseudo Blood Artist, or I guess not Blood Artist. What's the nerfed version of Blood Artist? The pirate there. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It doesn't trigger off your opponent's creatures. But still, getting to turn on that Aristocrat sacrifice ability, getting value every time something dies, on top of having the 2 bodies, which means this one card can potentially get you 2 triggers off of that max speed ability by itself as well. And you really start to see how a card like this becomes super relevant and has potential to be really, really good even in Standard. I can't wait to brew with it. I think it's going to be good in zombie decks. I think it's going to be good in aristocrat style sacrifice decks. I think there's so much potential to brew with this in a couple of different variations, a couple of different decks. And I'm excited. I'm excited to see just how deep it can go. It might even see play outside of tribal decks in just decks that are very consistently getting Start Your Engines up to max speed as even more payoff for those decks. Let me know how you want to use it in the comments. I think the card is nuts, and it's definitely a very high pick in Limited. Grab this thing and play it before your opponent does. But next up, we've got the last card of the day, and honestly my favorite. This is Riptide Gearhulk. This is the Azorius Gearhulk, a 2/5 artifact creature construct for 5 mana in the colors of Azorius. It has double strike, it has prowess, so it is a pretty relevant body for the mana. Not quite worth the mana all by itself, just with the body it gives you, but its ability when it enters is what puts it way over the top. When this creature enters, for each opponent you put up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. Now listen guys, my nose is really itchy. I have a lot of animals in the house, so I apologize, but this thing is nuts. This is basically a Ravenous Chupacabra that costs 1 extra mana, except it has a way better body, 2/5 double strike prowess instead of a 2/2. It counts as an artifact, which is relevant, and it's in way better colors for a card like that because white and blue have so many ways to flicker something like this so that you can reuse its enters the battlefield abilities, whereas black with Ravenous Chupacabra doesn't really have that. On top of that, you can target any non-land permanent, not just a creature, so the versatility in what this can hit is just through the roof. And then on top of that, you don't actually even destroy the thing, you put it into their deck third from the top. And I put this card up as a spoiler short earlier today, and I did get a comment talking about how they don't think this card is nearly as good as Chupacabra because it's not in the colors of Rakdos or something like that, because Destroy is better than putting something into their library. And I have to vehemently disagree with that comment, because getting to put a card into an opponent's library, even if it is third from the top, is so much better than actually destroying. If you try to destroy their creature with, you know, a Ravenous Chupacabra, they can use tricks that give Indestructible to stop it. They can use, you know, reanimation, things that get stuff back from the graveyard to get back that value immediately and reuse it. They can't do that if you put the card into their deck. And some people, if they're not thinking it through carefully, might think, well, in a few turns, they're going to get to just draw the thing again and you still have to deal with it, so it's not really gone. But they should have plenty of relevant threats in their deck, including probably 3 other copies of the thing you got rid of. So, like, if they haven't drawn into something that you still have to deal with in the next 3 turns, they're probably doing it wrong anyway. They're always going to draw into something that you're going to need to deal with, right? If they're playing a good deck. So I think the fact that it's, you know, they're definitely going to draw into the thing you get rid of like 3 turns from now or whatever is mostly irrelevant. Sure, there will be fringe cases where the thing you get rid of is so ridiculously powerful that ensuring they absolutely get to play it in 3 turns might be a downside. But most of the time, that's not going to be the case. Like, most of the time, you can expect they're going to draw into something as good as the thing you got rid of within the next 3 draws anyway. So the fact that they're actually drawing the thing you got rid of instead of whatever they would have drawn is not as relevant. And I still think putting it in their deck is probably the best form of removal you can have. Better than Destruction and way better than Exile. There's ways to get value off of Exile now, even within this set we've seen more. So yeah, I think this is very deceptively one of the best cards in the set. I really think this is nuts, and I absolutely think putting it into the library is going to be the best form of removal from this moment on. I honestly believe that. There's just so many ways to get value off of Exile, and with the way that things are going in Magic, it seems like we're only going to get more of that with time. There's an Orzhov God in this set that draws a card every time something is exiled, that sort of thing. I just feel like those payoffs are going to start to stack up over time and become very relevant. But this doesn't have to worry about any of that. It doesn't have to worry about all of the ways that destroying a creature can be bad. It's just gone. It's just gone. It's in their deck, and sure, they get to redraw it eventually. But like I said, they're going to be redrawing stuff that you need to deal with for the rest of the game anyway, so it doesn't really matter if it's exactly the thing you got rid of or not, right? At least in my mind. But let me know how you feel about it in the comments below, because, I mean, it could go either way. I'm only 99% sure. I'll open up that possibility, that 1% that maybe I'm wrong. So if you want to change my mind, let me know in the comments. If you agree with me and think that guy that commented on the short earlier is out of his mind, also let me know in the comments. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for checking out the video. Please like it to help me get it out to so many more people. I would appreciate it so much. Subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload, because I have tons of crazy content on the way. And catch me live Monday through Friday over on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/QuarantineCapricorn. Because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. This set's looking crazy. I can't wait to see what tomorrow brings. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.